The brakes were made to fail.
The marble floor of the Kim estate had never felt so cold beneath Carly Harris's bare feet. On the low glass table between them sat the divorce papers already signed, ink still wet in places, waiting only for her signature to finish what Kim Min-soo had started. He sat across from her in the wheelchair he still refused to call permanent, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "You deserve a real man," he said again, as if repeating it might make it easier to believe. The room did not answer him. Only the low hum of the humidifier by his medical bed and the distant tick of a clock neither of them had ever bothered to set correctly. 6 months earlier, this same room had been filled with doctors, machines, the frantic energy of survival. Now it held something worse than crisis. It held decision. Min-soo had spent weeks rehearsing this moment in his head, the cruelty measured out like medicine, just enough to make her leave, not enough to let her see how much it cost him to say it. Carly did not move to argue. She had learned, over 3 years of marriage into the Kim family, that arguing with a man determined to punish himself was like arguing with a locked door. You could pound on it forever, or you could simply turn the handle and see if it was really locked at all. "You've decided this already," she said quietly, not a question. "I decided it the day the doctors told me I'd never walk again." His voice did not shake, though his hands did. "You didn't marry a man in a wheelchair, Carly. You married a man who could give you children, who could stand beside you at galas instead of being wheeled into them like furniture. I won't let you waste your life on a shell of what you signed up for." "You didn't ask what I signed up for," she said. "You decided it for me, just like your mother decides everything for everyone in this house." Something flickered behind his eyes, a warning, maybe, or a flinch he couldn't quite hide. But he said nothing. Pride, Carly had come to understand, was the only Lim Min-soo trusted anymore. She picked up the pen. The Kim family had never truly accepted her. 3 years of state dinners where she was introduced as Min-soo's wife, instead of by her own name. 3 years of board members who assumed she was counting the zeros in his accounts instead of counting the days, until he'd let himself be loved without conditions. She had absorbed every slight because the man across from her, before the accident, before the silence, had once looked at her like she was the only steady thing in a family built on performance. That man was still in there. She could see him now, buried under the wreckage of his own shame, mistaking abandonment for generosity. So she signed. Page after page, her signature even and unhurried, while Min-soo watched with the stunned stillness of a man who had expected resistance and received grace instead. When she finished, she set the pen down beside his folded hands, close enough that he could have reached for it, for her, if he wanted to stop this. He didn't. She slid the wedding ring from her finger and placed it gently on top of the papers, the gold catching the low evening light one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for the years you let yourself love me before you decided I couldn't handle loving you back." Then she walked out of the room they had shared, out of the house that had never been hers, and did not look back, not because she felt nothing, but because she refused to let him see how much this had cost her either. Min-soo sat alone in the wheelchair long after her footsteps faded, staring at the ring on the table as if it might still explain itself to him. For the first time since the accident, a thought cut through his carefully built resolve. She didn't fight. Why didn't she fight? In the hallway, hidden just beyond the doorway's shadow, Min-soo's mother watched Carly go with a small, satisfied smile. The kind of smile belonging to someone who had drafted those very papers weeks before her son ever spoke the words aloud. 3 months had passed since the ring stopped explaining anything, and Min-soo still hadn't stopped asking the question. She didn't fight. Why didn't she fight? It followed him from the therapy room to the boardroom to the sleepless hours after midnight, a splinter that refused to surface. The Kim family's lawyers had offered Carly a settlement large enough to silence most people forever. She rejected it in a single email, 4 sentences long, polite and final. When they raised the number, she rejected it again. The board could not understand a woman who did not want their money. The tabloids, hungry for a scandal about a gold-digging foreign wife, found nothing to print except her silence, and silence did not sell papers. Carly had moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, the kind with thin walls and a view of nothing in particular. She returned to the humanitarian consulting work she had set aside during his recovery, the work that had once made her feel like herself instead of a name attached to someone else's fortune. Slowly, quietly, her name began appearing in reports and conferences, not as Minsu's wife, but as Carly Harris, full stop. It should have felt like freedom. Some nights, it only felt like proof that she could survive losing him, which was its own kind of grief. Minsu told himself he did not check on her. He told himself the news alerts on his phone were simply about due diligence, about protecting the family name from any liabilities she might still represent. He told himself this every time he opened an article about her latest project and read it twice. His rehabilitation, once approached with the same brutal discipline he used to expand the Kim empire, began to stall. He skipped sessions. He snapped at nurses who had done nothing wrong. Employees who once respected his sharp, exacting leadership began to whisper instead about his temper, about the meetings he canceled, about the decisions he could no longer make with a clear head. Into that vacuum stepped his younger cousin, Yi-won, smiling the practiced smile of a man who had been waiting his entire life for exactly this opportunity. In boardrooms, Yi-won spoke gently about stability and strong leadership the company supposedly needed now, always careful never to say the word wheelchair out loud, always careful to let the silence say it for him. Shareholders began taking his calls a little too quickly. Minsu noticed. Of course he noticed. He had built his entire life on noticing threats before they fully formed. But for the first time, he found himself too tired, too hollowed out to fight back the way he once would have. Late one night, unable to sleep, he wheeled himself into the private study and pulled up his own confidential legal files, searching for something, anything, that might explain how a marriage he had ended so decisively could still feel so unfinished. He was looking for clarity about Carly. What he found instead nearly stopped his heart. Buried in a folder he almost overlooked was a series of emails between his mother and the family's private physician, dated weeks before the divorce. References to adjusted prognosis reports. References to managing the timeline. A note, cold and precise in his mother's handwriting, instructing the doctor to emphasize permanence in his recovery outlook, even when early data suggested otherwise. His hands went still on the armrests of his chair. The medical reports he had built his entire decision on, the ones that told him he would never walk again, the ones that convinced him he had no right to keep Carly tied to a broken man, had been shaped, guided, weighted toward a specific, devastating conclusion. His mother had not simply supported the divorce. She had engineered it, long before Minsu ever found the courage or the cruelty to speak the words himself. The betrayal he had spent months searching for outside his own walls had been living inside them the entire time, sitting across from him at dinner, pouring his tea, calling him son with the same steady hand that had rewritten his future without his knowledge. Minsu stared at the screen until the words blurred, one thought rising above the wreckage of everything he thought he understood. If his mother could shape the truth about his body so easily, what else about that night, about the accident itself, had never been the accident he believed it was? That question sat with Minsu for 3 sleepless nights before he acted on it. He did not confront his mother. He did not confront the doctor. Instead, he did the one thing he had never done in his entire life as heir to the Kim empire. He started digging quietly, the way a man digs when he no longer trusts the ground beneath his own house. He began with the weeks surrounding the divorce, pulling old board minutes, old emails, old calendar records that had meant nothing to him at the time. What he found rearranged everything he thought he knew about the woman he had thrown out of his life. There was a board meeting 3 weeks before the papers were signed, one he had missed while recovering from a fever. In the transcript, a hostile shareholder had proposed removing Minsu entirely from leadership, citing his diminished capacity. Carly had been present, technically only as his spouse, with no voting power and no formal authority. And yet the transcript showed her speaking anyway, calmly, precisely, dismantling the shareholder's argument point by point until the motion quietly died in the room. She had fought for him in a battle he never knew had been declared. There was more. A rejected offer from a rival conglomerate, forwarded to her privately, offering a considerable sum in exchange for insider details about the Kim family's internal conflicts. Her response, still saved in the company's legal archive, was 2 lines long. She was not interested in profiting from a family that had never fully accepted her, even one that had hurt her. And then, the detail that finally broke something loose in his chest. A quiet transfer of funds, rooted through a private foundation, into an experimental spinal rehabilitation program overseas. The program doctors in Korea had quietly dismissed as too costly, too unproven, not worth pursuing for a case as severe as his. Carly had funded it herself, using savings from before their marriage, money that had nothing to do with the Kim fortune, weeks after she had already signed away her name. She had never stopped fighting for him. She had simply stopped fighting for herself in front of him because he had asked her not to. He found her 3 days later at a charity gala for children's health care, the kind of event she had once hated attending as his wife and now attended proudly as an independent advocate. She wore a plain green dress with no jewelry, the sort of quiet elegance that never needed his family's approval. When their eyes met across the room, something shifted in her posture, controlled but not cold. He approached carefully, aware of every camera, every whispering guest. "I know what you did," he said quietly once they were slightly apart from the crowd. "The board meeting, the rehabilitation program, all of it." Carly's expression did not soften the way he had hoped. "I did what I believed was right. That was never about winning you back." "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling small against everything he now understood. "I was wrong about you, about everything." "I believe that," she said simply. "But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, Minsu." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. He had expected anger. He had prepared for anger. What he received instead was worse, a quiet, settled boundary from a woman who had clearly done the work of grieving him already. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said, though some smaller, more desperate part of him wanted exactly that. "I just needed you to know I finally see it, all of it." Carly studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Seeing it is not the same as changing because of it," she said. "Come find me again when you've become a different man, not just a sorrier one." She left him standing there, the noise of the gala swelling back around him like water closing over a stone. That night, back at the estate, a man Minsu did not recognize was waiting quietly near the private entrance of his study. Introducing himself only as a former investigator once hired by the family's security division, the man placed a thin folder on the desk and said very little else. Inside were photographs, timestamps, and a maintenance record for the limousine involved in his accident, a record that had been altered after the fact. The brakes had not simply failed that night. They had been made to fail. And whoever gave that order still had access to every door inside the Kim estate. Whoever gave that order still had access to every door inside the Kim estate, and for the first time in his life, Minsu understood that safety was not something his money could buy back. He locked the folder in his private safe that night and did not sleep. By morning, he had made a decision. He would not react with rage. He would react with precision. He began quietly, the way Carly had once fought for him without ever raising her voice. He reviewed years of maintenance logs, cross-referenced staff schedules from the night of the accident, and identified 3 names with access to the garage that evening. One of them belonged to a security officer who had suddenly resigned 2 months after the crash, relocating overseas with a payment trail that led, eventually, back to an account controlled by his cousin Yiwon. Minsu did not confront him privately. He understood now that private confrontations only protected the powerful. Instead, he called an emergency board meeting, the kind he had once dominated on his own 2 feet, and rolled into the room in his wheelchair with the same folder the investigator had given him. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed the evidence on the table and let the silence do what shouting never could. Photographs, altered maintenance records, financial transfers. Yiwon's confident smile faltered for the first time in a year as executives who had quietly begun favoring him now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "For months," Minsu said, "this company was told a broken man could not lead it. What no one asked was who benefited from breaking him in the first place." Yiwon's resignation came within the week, followed swiftly by a quiet, humiliating exit from the family's board entirely. The scandal never fully reached the press, but inside the walls of the Kim empire, something fundamental cracked and rebuilt itself. Executives who once whispered about strong leadership now watched Minsu direct multi-million-dollar decisions from his wheelchair, with a clarity and composure he had lost in the year following his marriage's collapse. Slowly, deliberately, Min-soo began dismantling the very culture that had once measured his worth by his ability to stand. He restructured leadership evaluations around judgment and integrity rather than image. He funded accessibility projects across every company office without a single press release to advertise it. For the first time, he was not performing strength. He was practicing it. He did not call Carly. He did not send flowers or apologies dressed as strategy. Instead, he quietly donated to the same rehabilitation foundation she had once funded in secret, using his resources not to win her back, but because it was simply the right thing to do. It was Carly who reached out first, weeks later, requesting a meeting not as his former wife, but as a fellow board advisor for a new charitable foundation supporting spinal injury survivors and underserved communities. Min-soo agreed immediately, careful to keep his expectations small. Their first meeting was formal, almost stiff, two professionals discussing grant allocations across a long conference table. But something eased between them by the third meeting, then the fourth. One afternoon, reviewing a stack of proposals, Carly made a dry comment about a donor's overly dramatic mission statement, and Min-soo laughed before he could stop himself, a real laugh, unguarded and slightly rusty from disuse. Carly looked up, startled, then smiled despite herself. "I forgot that sound," she said quietly. They were not husband and wife in that room. They were something new, cautious equals rebuilding a bridge one honest conversation at a time. Min-soo no longer expected her to rescue him from his own pain, and Carly no longer needed him to prove anything to her. She simply needed to see, over time, whether the man in front of her was real. She watched him carefully in every meeting after that, nodding the way he credited his team instead of hoarding praise, the way he listened instead of dictating, the way he no longer mentioned his condition as either an excuse or a wound to be pitied. The change did not erase her caution. It only made her wonder how deep it truly went, and whether trusting it again was worth the risk of losing herself in him a second time. Then, on a quiet Tuesday, Min-soo received a call from the lead physician overseeing his case abroad. An experimental nerve regeneration treatment, once considered purely theoretical, had shown enough promising results in trial patients that he now qualified for early access. Partial mobility was not guaranteed, but for the first time since the accident, it was possible. Min-soo sat with the phone still warm against his ear long after the call ended, staring at the wheelchair's armrest, as though it might explain what to do with hope this fragile. He told no one. Not his mother. Not the board. Not Carly. He told no one about the treatment, but silence, Min-soo was learning, had a way of eating a man from the inside out. 2 months into the experimental program, undergoing sessions, he hid behind vague excuses about business travel. The full weight of the conspiracy behind his accident finally surfaced in public. Investigators, working quietly alongside evidence Min-soo himself had provided, traced the altered maintenance records directly back to Yiwon and a small circle of family loyalists who had conspired to remove him from power entirely. The scandal fractured the Kim family permanently. His mother, whose manipulation of his medical reports had never been forgiven, quietly stepped back from all involvement in the company, her image and authority both unsalvageable. The board, for the first time in company history, did not question whether Min-soo was strong enough to lead. They had watched him dismantle a conspiracy from a wheelchair with more composure than his able-bodied relatives had ever shown running from consequences. Stability returned to the company, though the family that once surrounded him would never fully be whole again. Through months of grueling therapy, the experimental treatment gave Min-soo something doctors had once called impossible. With the aid of leg braces and relentless daily practice, he regained limited movement, enough to stand for short periods, enough to take slow, deliberate steps with support. It was not the miracle recovery his younger self might have fantasized about. It was something smaller and somehow more honest. He chose not to announce it. No press conference. No triumphant photo of the chairman rising from his chair. He understood now that his worth had never been tied to his legs, and turning his recovery into a spectacle would only prove he had learned nothing at all. Instead, on a quiet afternoon, he asked Carly to meet him in the old neighborhood where they used to walk before the accident, before the wealth and the boardrooms and the wheelchair had complicated everything between them. It was the same street where, years earlier, they had once talked about an ordinary life, a small home, a future built on nothing but each other. Carly arrived to find him standing, braced but steady, leaning lightly against a lamppost with a patience that had nothing to do with his legs. "You're standing," she said softly, something unguarded slipping through her composure for the first time in months. "With help," Minsu said. "I'm learning that's not something to be ashamed of anymore." They walked slowly together, matching his pace without either of them mentioning it. For a while, neither spoke, letting the quiet street say what words might have rushed. "I spent a year believing you needed a perfect man," Minsu finally said. "Someone whole, someone who could stand without shaking, someone who could give you a life without complications. I never once asked what you actually wanted. I decided for you the same way my family always decided things for me. I am sorry for that. I don't expect it to fix anything." Carly stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "I never wanted a real man the way you imagined it, Minsu. I never cared about your legs. I cared about whether you would let me stand beside you, or whether you would always try to carry everything alone and call it love." "I don't want to carry it alone anymore," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to come back because I'm afraid of losing you again. I'm asking for the chance to earn your trust, slowly, honestly, without any of the old pride between us." For a long moment, Carly studied him, searching his face for the calculation, the performance, the old habits of a man who solved pain by pushing people away. She found none of it, only quiet, unguarded honesty. She reached out and took his hand, not because he could stand, but because he had finally stopped pretending he needed to stand alone to be worthy of her. "There's something I never told you," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a folded, slightly worn piece of paper. "I kept our original wedding vows, the unsigned copy. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away even after everything." Minsu stared at the paper, memories flooding back of two people who had once promised each other forever without fully understanding what forever would ask of them. Carly smiled, soft and unguarded. "Would you like to write new ones together? Ones that don't come from two people trying to be perfect for each other, just two people trying to be honest." Minsu held her hand a little tighter, steady despite the braces, steady despite everything the past year had broken and rebuilt in him. "Yes," he said. "Let's write something neither of us has to carry alone." They stood together on that quiet street, not as the powerful